She asked me to teach her to drive on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I said yes without thinking, the way you say yes to something that feels small and harmless and completely uncomplicated. I didn't know then that she already knew how to drive. I didn't know then that she had held a license for 6 years, that she had driven cross-country twice, that she could parallel park on a hill in the rain without breaking a sweat. I didn't know any of that. I just said yes, and that yes changed everything. Let me take you back to the week before she asked me. My name is James. I'm 31 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm that does mostly commercial buildings, and I live in a second-floor apartment in a neighborhood that's in the slow, pleasant process of becoming something better than it used to be. There's a bakery on the corner that opened 6 months ago, a bookshop that keeps odd hours, a coffee place where the owner still writes your name wrong on the cup on purpose because she thinks it's funny. I've lived here for 4 years, and up until 8 months ago, the most interesting thing about my day-to-day life was the walk to work, which takes exactly 11 minutes and passes a park where an old man feeds pigeons every single morning regardless of weather. Then my neighbor across the hall moved out, and Clara moved in. I didn't meet her the day she arrived. I heard her. She had a portable speaker and apparently strong opinions about moving soundtracks, because she unpacked to a playlist that went from something slow and classical to something that was unmistakably an early 2000s pop song I hadn't thought about in 15 years. I stood in my kitchen making coffee and listened through the wall and thought, whoever this person is, they're going to be interesting. I met her 3 days later in the elevator. She was carrying a box that was clearly too heavy for one person, and I held the door open and offered to help. And she looked at me with this very particular expression. Not quite suspicion, not quite warmth. Somewhere in between, and said, "I'm fine, but thank you." Then the box shifted, and a stack of books slid sideways, and she had to grab the wall to stabilize it, and I caught the books before they hit the floor. She looked at me again. "Okay," she said. "Maybe a little help." Her name was Clara Voss. She was 28. She had just transferred to a new position at the design firm 2 blocks away, and she had moved across the city for the job without knowing anyone in this part of town. She told me all of that in the elevator, in the same efficient, no-frills way she probably introduced herself in professional settings. I told her my name and my floor and offered that the coffee on the corner was actually good despite the name misspelling situation, and she said she'd keep that in mind. We became the kind of neighbors who exist in the comfortable middle distance of acquaintance. We exchanged good mornings. We held the elevator. We ran into each other at the mailboxes and talked about nothing for 2 or 3 minutes before going our separate ways. She borrowed a Phillips head screwdriver in February and returned it the same day with a handwritten sticky note attached that just said, "Thank you, C." I still have that sticky note. I'm aware of how that sounds. The first time we had a real conversation was in March, 7 months before the driving thing. There was a thunderstorm on a Wednesday evening, and both of us were standing under the awning outside our building waiting for it to ease up. She had groceries. I had nothing. We both had nowhere to be. "Do you do this often?" she asked. "Stand outside in the rain?" "Only when I forget my umbrella." She glanced at my hands. "You don't have an umbrella?" I didn't forget it. "I don't own one." She looked at me like I had said something in a language she didn't quite speak. "You live in a city that rains 9 months of the year." I find it humbling. She stared at me for a half-second, and then she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her like she hadn't been expecting me to be funny. I hadn't been expecting it either. The rain kept going for 20 minutes, and we stood there talking about small things. The bookshop's strange hours, the pigeons in the park, the ongoing mystery of why the elevator smelled like cinnamon every Thursday. And by the time it slowed enough to walk through, something between us had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. After that, we talked more. Proper conversations. She would knock on my door on Saturday mornings sometimes because she'd made too much coffee, and I started leaving the door slightly open when I was home on weekend afternoons because I'd learned she knocked quietly and hated the idea of being heard in a hallway. She lent me books. I helped her hang a large framed print that required 3 attempts to get level. We ate dinner in the hallway once, sitting on the floor with takeout containers between us because her kitchen table was being used as a surface for a design project, and my kitchen table only had room for one. I liked her. That is the simple, uncomplicated version of what I felt. I liked her more than I had liked anyone in a long time. And I was careful about it in the way you're careful about something that matters. Which is to say, I didn't say anything at all. Then she knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and when I opened it, she was holding a jacket over her arm and looked slightly hesitant in a way that was unusual for her. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. You drive, right?" "I've seen you with the car. I had a car." "A dark blue sedan I kept in the lot behind the building and used mostly on weekends." "Yeah, I never learned," she said. I never got comfortable with it. I always meant to, and then I just didn't. And now I feel like I should, and I was wondering—" She stopped, took a small breath. "Would you be willing to teach me? I'll pay for gas. And food, whatever. I think I'd be less nervous with someone I know." And I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was standing in my doorway, looking almost vulnerable, which was not something I had seen from her before, and she was asking me for help, and I wanted very much to be useful to her in any way she'd allow. So I said yes, and we made a plan for Saturday morning, and she smiled and said thank you, and went back across the hall. And I stood in my doorway for a moment longer than necessary before closing my door. I didn't find out the truth until 3 weeks later. Our first lesson was in the large, mostly empty parking lot of a shopping center that went quiet on Saturday mornings. I drove us there and explained that we'd start in the lot, get her comfortable with the basic controls, and work up gradually. Clara sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel at a precise 10-2 position and looked completely composed. I ran through the basics: ignition, mirrors, gear shift, brake pressure. And she listened carefully and nodded at the right moments and asked the kinds of specific, practical questions that suggested she had been paying close attention. Then she put the car in drive and pulled forward. Smooth and steady and controlled. I watched her. "A little more brake when you approach the line," I said, because I had to say something. "Got it," she said. She braked at exactly the right moment. She made a wide turn at one end of the lot, adjusted her mirror check before doing it, came back the other direction. I watched her hands on the wheel. They were steady, confident without being aggressive. The kind of hands that had done this before. "You're doing really well," I said. She glanced at me briefly. "Thank you. Have you had any lessons before? Even informal ones?" "A little," she said. "A long time ago." She changed lanes, smoothly. I told myself I was imagining things. The second Saturday was on a quiet residential street. Light traffic, a few stop signs, the kind of environment I would have used with an actual beginner. Clara handled all of it without hesitation. She yielded correctly. She signaled well in advance. She parallel parked on the third try, which I knew even then was better than most experienced drivers. 3 tries, she said when she pulled out of the space. "Is that bad?" 3 tries is fine, I said. She frowned slightly. "I feel like I should have gotten it on 2. That's when I started to suspect. Not fully. Not enough to say anything. Just a small, persistent feeling that something wasn't adding up. But I let it go because the lessons were the best part of my week. We spent an hour driving and then another hour somewhere nearby. A diner. A park, a coffee shop. Talking the way we had talked under the awning in March. Easy and warm and like there was more to say than we had time for. By the third Saturday, I was certain. We were on a longer road, and there was a moment when a cyclist came out of nowhere from a side path, and Clara's reaction time was instant and perfect. She didn't flinch. She didn't overcorrect. She slowed with exactly the right pressure, let the cyclist clear, accelerated again, completely calm. I sat in the passenger seat and looked at her profile against the window, and I thought, she already knows how to drive. And then the other thought came quietly behind it. She knows, and she hasn't said anything. And neither have I. And every Saturday morning she knocks on my door and we spend the day together and she keeps coming back. I didn't know what to do with that. So I did nothing. I kept giving the lessons. I kept watching her drive with the confidence of someone who had been driving for years. I kept pointing out things I knew she already knew. Check your mirrors, signal early, watch the pedestrian. And she kept nodding and doing exactly what I said. We were both performing, and neither of us was willing to be the first one to stop. The fourth Saturday, it rained. We drove anyway because Clara said she should probably learn to drive in rain, which was objectively true and also a reason to spend another morning together. The streets were wet, the windows fogged at the edges, and the world outside had that particular quiet that rain gives to Saturday mornings. She drove carefully, which was different from her usual confident handling, more attentive, more gentle, like she was giving the road the respect it was asking for. We ended up at a small cafe near the river with outdoor tables that had been moved inside for the season. We ordered coffee and 2 different pastries and split both of them, which had become something we did without discussing, and she was talking about a project at work, a commission for a public building that she was excited about, and I was listening, and I was watching her hands around the mug. And I thought, I have to say something because this can't keep going the way it's going. But I didn't say anything that day. Or the next. I said something on the 5th Saturday, and the way it happened was this. We had driven to a wide, open area outside the city, farmland, and long straight roads and sky in every direction. Clara had suggested it the week before. She said she wanted to practice on open roads, which was the kind of thing a person who already knew how to drive might suggest, because it sounded more advanced and therefore more credible as a lesson. I had agreed without saying what I was thinking. We'd been out there for about 40 minutes. She was driving at a comfortable speed, the windows slightly down, the smell of cut grass and cooling October air coming through. The road stretched ahead of us nearly empty, and something about the openness of it, the quiet, the fact that there was nothing around for miles, made it feel like the right moment. Or maybe I was just tired of carrying the knowledge alone. Clara, How long have you had your license? The car didn't swerve. She didn't flinch. But I saw her hands adjust on the wheel, the smallest readjustment, and I knew she had heard exactly what I was asking. A pause. Long enough that I counted it. 6 years, she said. The word settled in the car like something that had been waiting for a long time to find its place. I looked out the passenger window at the field going by. I didn't say anything immediately because I was figuring out what I felt, and what I felt was complicated. There was something that might have been annoyance, and something that was definitely amusement, and underneath both of those, something else entirely, something that felt a lot like relief, though I couldn't have explained why. You already know how to drive, I said. Yes. You've known the whole time. Yes. I turned to look at her. She was still watching the road, jaw set slightly. The way she looked when she was waiting for something she'd already accepted might be uncomfortable. Why? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The road curved gently, and she followed the curve without thinking about it. Because I wanted to spend time with you, she said, and I couldn't think of another reason that you'd say yes. I let that sit. The road went on. Fields on both sides, sky wide and pale above them. A flock of birds crossed ahead of us, and she watched them and didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. And the silence between us wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that happens when 2 people are both trying to figure out what happens next. You could have just asked me to get coffee, I said finally. She glanced at me for just a second. I know. We've gotten coffee several times. I know. That's been fine. The coffee felt like something you do with a neighbor, she said quietly. I wanted something that was just ours. I thought about all the Saturday mornings, the parking lot with the shopping center that went quiet on weekends, the wet streets in the rain, the long road with the cyclist, the cafe with the fogged windows, all of it arranged around something she already knew how to do, so that we would have a reason to be in the same small space every week with nowhere else to be. That's the most elaborate thing anyone has ever done to spend time with me, I said. It wasn't that elaborate. You maintained a fiction about your driving ability for 5 weeks. She exhaled, and I thought she might be embarrassed. But then I heard it. Just underneath the exhale, a small sound that was almost a laugh. Trying not to be a laugh. Losing the effort, she pressed her lips together and failed entirely. "Pull over," I said. She looked at me, surprised. "What? Pull over? You've been driving for 40 minutes. I want to drive back." She pulled onto the shoulder of the road and put the car in park. We sat for a moment with the engine idling. Then I said, "Get out! James, get out of the car!" She got out. I got out on my side. We met at the front of the car, standing in the October grass with the road empty in both directions, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her before. Open, uncertain, younger than she usually let herself appear. "I'm sorry I lied," she said. "I know it was a strange thing to do." It was a strange thing to do. I kept trying to tell you. But then the lessons kept being... She stopped. Looked down briefly. They kept being good, and I kept not wanting to end them. I thought about my own silence. The 3 weeks of knowing and saying nothing. The way I had kept pointing out things I knew she already knew. Kept taking the long way back to the city, kept finding reasons to make the afternoon last a little longer. "I knew," I said. "I figured it out on the 3rd week." She looked up. "What?" The cyclist. "Your reaction was too fast, too clean. You've been driving for years." Her expression shifted. "You knew, and you kept going?" "Yes." We stood there looking at each other in the October light, the grass cool and damp under our shoes, and then she said something very quietly, more to herself than to me. "We're both idiots." "We really are." She laughed. A real one this time, surprised and warm and full, and I started laughing too because there was nothing else to do. And we stood on the shoulder of that long, empty road and laughed at ourselves, and at the 5 weeks of elaborate, mutually sustained pretending that had brought us to this exact spot. If you've ever gone to extraordinary lengths to spend more time with someone and then discovered they were going to equally extraordinary lengths for exactly the same reason, you know the feeling. It's the most embarrassing kind of relief. It's the best kind. I drove back. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the road and occasionally corrected my turns as some kind of delayed revenge, and I let her because it made her laugh every time. By the time we got back to the city, it was early afternoon, and we drove past the parking lot of the shopping center where we'd had the first lesson, and she pointed at it. "Do you think it was too quiet in there?" she said. "As a lesson location." I thought it was good for a beginner. She gave me a look. "Which you weren't." I added. "No, but I didn't know that. But you figured it out on week 3. And you figured out that I figured it out right now. We went back and forth like that the whole way home. Comfortable and a little giddy. The way you feel when something that's been held under tension for a long time is finally just allowed to be what it is." I parked in the lot behind the building. We walked up together. At the landing between our 2 doors, we stopped, and I looked at her. And she looked at me with that same open expression she'd had on the road. "6th Saturday," she said. "Do we still have a lesson?" "I think you've probably graduated. What if I want to keep going anyway?" "Then we're just 2 people spending Saturday mornings together." She considered this with a slight tilt of her head. "I could live with that." "Good," I said, "because I've been driving you somewhere for an extra 20 minutes every week just to make the morning longer." Her expression didn't change exactly, but something in her eyes did. Something softened and brightened at the same time. "I noticed," she said. "I thought you might have." I didn't say anything. "Neither did I." She smiled. Slow, genuine, the kind of smile that means something different than a polite one. She reached over and tucked something into my jacket pocket, and I looked down to see it was a sticky note. She had it in her hand the whole time. I realized she had come prepared, and on it in her handwriting it said, "Thank you, C, for all of it." She went inside before I could respond. I stood at my door for a moment and read the sticky note twice. And then I put it in my jacket pocket and went inside and stood in my kitchen thinking about the 6th Saturday. And the one after that, and the one after that. All the mornings we hadn't run out of reasons for yet. I should tell you what the week between the 5th and 6th Saturday felt like, because it was different from the weeks before it, and different matters when you've been paying attention to the small things. Before the fifth Saturday, before the Open, road and the cyclist confession and everything that followed. The in-between weeks had a particular texture, pleasant but faintly anxious. The way you feel when you have something you want very much but haven't let yourself reach for yet. I would get home on Saturday evenings and think about the next Saturday. I would hear her door close across the hall on a weekday morning and think about whether she was running early or late. I would make coffee and think about the way she held a mug with both hands, the way she listened when something genuinely interested her, not politely, but fully, leaning forward just slightly, eyes tracking. After the fifth Saturday, the week felt different, lighter. There was still something unresolved, but the anxiety had changed into something more like anticipation. On Tuesday, I knocked on her door to return a pen I'd borrowed 3 weeks earlier, and she answered in a paint-stained shirt with her hair up and a streak of something blue on her forearm. And she took the pen and said, "You kept this for 3 weeks," and I said, "I was waiting for the right moment." And she looked at me for a half-second with those eyes that saw too much and said, "Sure you were?" Then she went back inside, but she was smiling. I heard it even with my back turned. On Thursday, she texted me a photo of a very flat, very smooth gray rock she'd found on her walk to work. Underneath it, she'd typed 48. I looked at it longer than I should have, standing in an elevator with a cup of coffee. I typed back, "Nice form." She replied, "I know." I put my phone away and stood there with something warm in my chest that I didn't try to name. The sixth Saturday, we drove to the coast. It was her idea, and she said it was because she wanted to practice on highway speeds, which I didn't argue with because it was technically still plausible, and also because the coast was 2 hours each way, and that meant 4 hours in the car together before we even got out. She drove the whole way there, flawlessly, efficiently, with the ease of someone who had put tens of thousands of miles on a car. I watched the ocean appear on the horizon and said nothing about her driving. We parked at a small beach lot and walked down to the water. The tide was out. The sand was cold and firm under our shoes. She found a flat rock and put it in her jacket pocket. And when I asked why, she said she collected them, flat ones from different places, and she had 47 at home on a shelf. I thought about the shelf I'd never seen, and the apartment across the hall, and the months of incremental mornings, and I thought, I want to see the shelf. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Probably. On the day you knocked on my door. The Tuesday in October." "Yes." "How long had you been planning to ask me?" She looked out at the water. The wind came off it cold and direct and moved her hair. "A while," she said. "I kept coming up with other ideas and then talking myself out of them. Then someone at work mentioned they were taking driving lessons, and I thought—" She stopped, gave a small shake of her head. "I thought it was either the strangest idea I'd ever had or the best one." "It was both. It was both," she agreed. We parked at a small beach lot and walked down to the water. The tide was out. The sand was cold and firm under our shoes. She found a flat rock and put it in her jacket pocket. And when I asked why, she said she collected them, flat ones from different places, and she had 47 at home on a shelf. I thought about the shelf I'd never seen, and the apartment across the hall, and the months of incremental mornings, and I thought, I want to see the shelf. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Probably. On the day you knocked on my door. The Tuesday in October." "Yes." "How long had you been planning to ask me?" She looked out at the water. The wind came off it cold and direct and moved her hair. "A while," she said. "I kept coming up with other ideas and then talking myself out of them. Then someone at work mentioned they were taking driving lessons, and I thought—" She stopped, gave a small shake of her head. "I thought it was either the strangest idea I'd ever had or the best one." "It was both." "It was both," she agreed. "What were the other ideas?" I said. "The ones you talked yourself out of." She picked up another flat rock and held it in her palm, testing its weight. There was a farmer's market I wanted to go to, but that felt too obvious. Too clearly a date before I knew if you'd want it to be one. "What else?" "A documentary series. 7 parts. I thought maybe we'd watch it together." but that felt presumptuous. You'd be at my place for hours and might feel obligated to stay. Clara, I have spent every Saturday morning with you for 5 weeks. By choice. I know that now. She said it simply, without embarrassment. One of the things I had come to understand about her. She didn't perform regret. She just acknowledged the situation and moved forward. At the time, I didn't know what you wanted, so I picked something that gave you an obvious out. You could have said you weren't comfortable teaching someone, and that would have been the end of it. She turned the rock over in her hand. It was the most low-stakes thing I could think of that still required us to be alone together for a consistent stretch of time. I thought about the careful engineering of it. A built-in exit neither of us had taken. You're very strategic, I said. I'm a designer, she said. I solve problems. We walked along the water's edge. The waves came in low and flat, exhausted from the journey. She picked up another flat rock and held it in her palm, testing its weight. James. Yeah. I'm glad you said yes. I looked at her profile against the gray sky and the open water, the rock in her hand. The collar of her jacket turned up against the wind. I'm glad you asked, I said. And then, because it felt like the moment for it, the kind of moment that only works if you don't wait it out, I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. She turned to look at me. She didn't say anything, but she held on. We stood there for a while. The water came in and went out. The wind kept moving. A pair of birds went past low over the waves. She leaned slightly into my shoulder the way people lean into warmth. And I thought about the Tuesday in October and the parking lot on Saturday mornings, and the rain and the open road and the cyclist and the sticky note and the 47 flat rocks on a shelf I hadn't seen yet. Some things take longer than they need to. That's the truth about most of the things that matter. You circle around them for months, inventing reasons, talking yourself out of it, waiting for a moment that feels less risky. Clara invented a whole lesson plan. I invented 40 extra minutes of driving. Neither of us was willing to simply say the obvious thing. But we found our way to the same place anyway. The way you always do when two people want the same thing badly enough to be patient, or elaborate, or quietly reckless in small ways that build up over time into something that finally tips. She drove back from the coast, too. Highway the whole way. Confident and unhurried, one hand on the wheel, the other eventually finding the center console where I put my hand close enough that it wasn't accidental. The 7th Saturday she cooked. I showed up at her door and she had made too much breakfast, she said. And I sat at the kitchen table I'd never sat at before and looked at the shelf with 47 flat rocks and one new one from the coast, and the framed print we'd hung together that was finally level, and all the small evidence of her life that I had been adjacent to for months without being inside of it. The 7th Saturday, she cooked. I showed up at her door and she had made too much breakfast, she said. And I sat at the kitchen table I'd never sat at before and looked at the shelf with 47 flat rocks and one new one from the coast, and the framed print we'd hung together that was finally level, and all the small evidence of her life that I had been adjacent to for months without being inside of it. The apartment looked different from inside it than it had looked from across the hall, and I don't just mean physically. There was a quality to sitting in the space, where someone actually lives and where they make coffee at 6 a.m. and read and leave books, face down on the armchair and arrange rocks on a shelf because they like the way flat things look in a line. That felt more intimate than I'd been prepared for, not uncomfortable. The opposite of uncomfortable, like something that had been slightly out of focus had gone sharp. She had made eggs and toast and cut fruit into a bowl, and there was real coffee from a proper machine she clearly cared about, and she moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who was comfortable being watched, which I appreciated because I was watching. "You have a nice kitchen," I said. "The light in the morning is good," she said. It was the second thing I noticed when I looked at the apartment. What was the first? She sat down across from me with her coffee. The hallway. The elevator landing. I thought, whoever lives across from this door, we're going to run into each other all the time. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a revelation, just as information. I wanted to know what that was going to be like before I signed anything. And? I didn't see you until 3 days after I moved in. She looked at her mug. But I heard you. You make coffee at 7:15. You leave for work exactly 11 minutes after that. You come home between 6 and 6:30, and you sometimes stand in your kitchen in the evening not turning the light on for a few minutes before you do. I looked at her. You noticed all of that before we met. I notice things. It's what I do. She said it simply, without apology. I wasn't trying to be strange about it. I was just paying attention. I thought about my own side of the hall. The sticky note I still had. The 11 minutes I'd learned was her exact commute length. The Thursday morning I'd timed my own departure, to cross paths with her at the elevator, and then felt embarrassed about it for the rest of the day. I came home an extra 20 minutes early 3 Wednesdays. In a row, I said, because I'd noticed you were usually back around 6 and I thought we might run into each other at the mailboxes. She raised her eyes from the mug. Did it work? She said. Twice. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, we've been paying attention to each other for a long time. Yes, I said, and neither of us said anything. No. She looked at me across the kitchen table with morning light coming through the window onto the shelf of flat rocks, and she said, Why? And I said because it was the truth. Because I wasn't sure you wanted me to. She held her coffee mug in both hands the way she always did, and she looked at me steadily and she said, I knocked on your door and invented a reason to spend every Saturday morning with you. I know that. Now, James, I know. I am not a subtle person when I decide I want something. She set the mug down. I am, however, very patient about the approach. The approach, I said. The approach, she confirmed. After breakfast, I washed the dishes because she had cooked. And she stood next to me and dried them. And there was a moment when our arms crossed, reaching for the same towel, and neither of us moved away. The apartment was quiet except for the sounds of the street coming. Through the cracked window. I have a confession, she said. Another. One. This one is smaller. She put the glass. She was drying on the shelf. I could have parallel parked on the first try. On the second Saturday, I know. She turned to look at me. You know? I thought 3 tries felt like the right amount to seem believable, I said. So did you, apparently. She stared at me. You were coaching me to be convincingly bad. You were performing being convincingly bad. We're still both idiots. We really are, I said. She laughed and leaned against the counter, and I leaned next to her, and we stayed there like that. Shoulders touching, close enough that I could have turned and closed the remaining distance without any effort at all. I didn't, not yet. There was something I was still enjoying about this. The long, deliberate approach, the patience of it, the way everything was building towards something we both already knew was coming, but hadn't quite allowed to arrive. James, she said. Yeah. Stop being patient. And so I turned. And I did, and she had already turned too. And that was the end of the lessons and the beginning of everything else. The 8th Saturday we drove nowhere in particular. She sat in the passenger seat and I drove, and she navigated us through neighborhoods we didn't know, picking turns at random, finding streets neither of us had been on before. We got briefly lost in a residential grid and had to backtrack, and she found it funnier than I did, and I found her finding it funnier than she did. We ended up in a part of the city I barely knew, at a small park with a view of the river, and we sat on a bench and watched the water and didn't say much because we didn't need to. On the drive home, she fell asleep in the passenger seat. Not deeply, just that light, soft sleep that happens on a warm afternoon in a moving car. I drove slowly. I took the long way back. I always take the long way back. I know now that the thing she gave me wasn't driving lessons. We were both very clear about that from the start, even if neither of us said it out loud. What she gave me was a reason that worked for both of us, a structure for something that didn't have a name yet, a set of Saturday mornings that became the scaffolding for something neither of us had known how to build directly. You need that sometimes. You need a reason that gives you enough cover to do the thing you actually want to do. And if the reason is a little elaborate, a little strange, a little bit of a sustained fiction, well, the things that last usually start with someone willing to be a little reckless about wanting them. There's a flat rock on my kitchen windowsill now. She put it there on a Thursday evening in November, small and gray and perfectly smooth, the kind she likes. 49th in her collection, but the first one she gave away. I didn't ask why that one. I just left it where she put it. Some things you don't need to explain. You just let them stay.